So good evening everyone. Before I introduce myself, I would just like to go over the chat function that we'll be using this evening in order for you to ask a question during the talk. At the bottom middle of your screen, you should see a little chat box. If not, just simply wiggle your mouse and it should appear. Click on this box and then it will open a side box, and at the bottom of that the wee cursor should appear for you to type your question. Simply type your question, and once the presentation is finished, I'll ask Susan the questions that have been asked. If you want to get rid of the chat box during the presentation, just simply click on it again and it should disappear. I hope that that makes sense. So good evening, my name's Leslie Jack. I'm the Office Manager at Clackmannanshire Third Sector Interface, CTSI for short. I'm also the Clackmannanshire Tapestry Coordinator. For those of you who don't know, we were instrumental along with the Council to bring the Great Tapestry of Scotland to Clackmannanshire in 2017, where it was displayed from May till August in the Spear Centre in Alva. At the end of the project, we had a little bit of funding left, so my boss, CTSI's Chief Officer Anthea Coulter, who is here amongst us tonight, thought it would be an amazing opportunity for us to ask Andrew Crummy, the artist and designer of the Great Tapestry of Scotland, if he would design Clackmannanshire our own panel. Andrew was absolutely delighted at this, but one panel soon turned into 5 panels. As Clackmannanshire was bustling with so many industries, we couldn't fit them all in all the wonderful history into one panel. I'm pleased to say that the 5 panels are well underway being stitched and they're looking absolutely stunning, and they'll be a huge asset to Clackmannanshire. To go alongside the Clackmannanshire tapestry, we thought it would be a great opportunity to delve into the historical archives and have some fantastic historical talks to remind us of the rich history we had here in Clackmannanshire. And I'm delighted to be working alongside Susan Mills. Susan was Clackmannanshire Council's Museum and Heritage Officer from 1999 to 2017. She's a Director of Clackmannanshire Heritage Trust and a Trustee of Dollar Museum. Anyway, that's enough from me. I'm now going to pass you over to the wonderful Susan Mills. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you. That's a very kind introduction. And as Leslie said, she asked if we could plan some talks, because anyone who saw the Great Tapestry when it was in Alva, you would have seen, you probably knew that we planned a series of talks that went to accompany that. Lunchtime talks in the ceremony room in the Spears Centre then. So I decided I would do some of the talks this time around. This time it was all about Clackmannanshire, obviously, and I asked various people I knew to do them, and they were supposed to happen in April and May, but obviously that just didn't happen. So Leslie asked me a while ago if I would like to try Zooming. What do we do? How do we survive without Zooming, I wonder. So this is the first time I have done this. I've attended 1 or 2 Zoom lectures, so I know how it operates, but we're about to see how well it works tonight. So forgive me if it's a bit rough. I'm doing this again tomorrow night, and I'm sure I'll do it better tomorrow night, but hopefully it'll be okay tonight. So I'm now going to share the screen with you, and in a minute you will see the talk, I hope. Share. Just a second. Slideshow from beginning. Right, okay. Can you all see that? Yes?
Yeah.
Great. Good. Okay, well, I can't give you every detail. We'll just have to see how it goes, how it works as we go along. And but there's the title, and we'll make a start. I show this picture almost every time. Can you all hear me clearly, by the way? Yeah? Okay. Yeah, I show this in almost every lecture I give, as long as it's relevant, obviously. It just really shows the county to great, or most of the county to great advantage, and makes, you can make the point that you want to make. Obviously, this is Alva by the 4th Alva inch and so on. The ochels there, And the settlements, Menstrie sadly not on this picture, but there's Alva, there's Tillicoultry, and Dollar is there and a bit invisible up to further east. But although there's been no archaeological evidence of settlement, of occupation or buildings that's been found along the Hillfoots, we know that people were living there from at least from prehistoric times onwards, because there have been some burials found, cremation urns and so forth over the years. And not surprisingly, people were settling, settled themselves around the water supplies. Here's the Alva Glen here, and so on as we go along, and Tillicoultry Glen there. And they settled where there was a good water supply. They didn't settle on the low ground at the bottom, but on the Hillfoots, aptly named, along the foot of the hills. And it's slightly raised. You can see that the settlements first started a bit further up, off the low ground, where there was still a chance of flooding, and sadly where there is still a chance of flooding today. These early maps, the top one's by John Adair in about 1681, and the bottom one is Stobie's map of 1783. Very stylized Mount Hills, obviously, but you can see that by then you've got Menstrie there. Alva is very, very tiny, just around this area here, and there's Alva House, the Alva estate there, and there's Tillicoultry there, and Castle Campbell at the top there, and the very tiny Dollar down here. It was barely there, very small settlement. And there's the River Devon snaking its way along on the flatter land below. I'm not going to talk about any of the other places. We're just focusing on the Hillfoots today. And then on William Stobie's map, which is much more detailed, and obviously cartography was improving by leaps and bounds during the 18th century. There is Menstrie, and you can see the back road, as it's still called today, running along more clearly now along the foot of the hill. So you've got Menstrie, Alva, still very small, the silver mine mentioned there that were discovered on Sir John Erskine's land around 1714 or so there, the Alva House and Estate and Tillicoultry House, and there is Westerton, W Tillicoultry, Westerton of Tillicoultry there, and then Easterton of Tillicoultry here, which has kind of disappeared. It's all one now, but Easterton was probably around where the Harveston estate was, a little bit to the west of that. And then again, Dollar there and Castle Campbell up there. So Dollar, extremely small still, just a tiny village in the late 18th century. The settlements probably started off, there would be a small farm towns, as they were called, or firmtowns, with cottages clustered together. Some developed into proper farms over time. Others, the villages and towns developed from them. And a lot of the people would be keeping sheep on the hillside. Scottish blackface sheep, bred first in Tweeddale, were the predominant breed of sheep which were kept on the Ochils at that time. These paintings, I quite like them. I rescued them from the very first version of the exhibition at the Clock Mill, the Mill Trail Visitor Centre in Tillicoultry. I didn't keep them because they were very grubby. They'd been hanging around for 30 odd years, but I scanned them and then I'm afraid I chucked them out because they just weren't good enough quality, in good enough condition to keep, but they look fine for this. And there's a sort of naive charm about them, so I think they work quite well. So the following on from keeping the sheep, I think as soon as people knew that wool was a good thing to use for making clothes, which they did for, you know, thousands of years, they, by the time we're talking about, by the middle of the 16th century, it was still a domestic industry, but they were able to make some quite refined cloth, obviously. And these are just some examples of the women, generally speaking, prepared the wool. There is a lady, probably in the Western Isles, teasing and preparing it. And this model, which was made for Fleming and Reed, which became absorbed into Patons and Baldwin's, later on. Fleming and Reed, I think, were in Greenock. This model was actually made for the 1938 Glasgow Empire exhibition, and it actually shows the cottage industry from which Paton's and all of these wool spinners had started. And it shows the whole process. There's a little girl teasing the wool with the teasel pads, which were often made actually of teasels, later on made of wire. And then the woman is spinning the wool on a medium-sized wheel. This is a muckle wheel at the top here, so called because it's so big. These are just more ordinary ones. That's quite a big. She's winding the yarn. These two, I think that was taken in the Highlands. I don't know exactly where. These two photographs are in Clackmannanshire's Archives Local History Collection, are supposed to be in Alva, although I don't know precisely where. And this lady here is using a yarn winder, as indeed is this lady here, and winding hanks or skeins of yarn. So that all was done by the women, and it was the men who did the weaving. And the cottages often had sheds at the side of them, or the loom might be in part of the cottage. And this is a typical 19th century, and probably not so different from earlier ones, wooden weaving loom. This was made in Galashiels, and there is an advert there which you'll be able to see, Thomas Kennedy Galashiels, and this actually was made in the Thomas Kennedy works, and you can see makers of hand looms and so on, and shuttles. And this loom was in the Mill Trail Visitor Centre. This is the Mill Trail Visitor Centre when it was in the former Glentanner Mill. There's a male weaver in his work shed in Kirriemuir, slightly different loom, but the principles are the same. And I think this lady is on Harris or Lewis, making Harris tweed as well later on. That's more into the 20th century. He looks sort of turn of the 19th, 20th century. So these are the sort of looms that would be used in the houses. And as I say, the women prepared the wool, the men wove the cloth. The women, there they are preparing the fleeces and starting cleaning them and so on. And anyone they also, of course, walked, as it's called, W-A-U-L-K, ED in Scotland, fulling in England. They also finished the cloth. Anyone who's watched the first season of Outlander, or if you're a fan of Outlander, you will possibly remember an amusing scene where Claire, the heroine, meets a whole group of ladies in the Highlands who are busy walking the cloth. And of course, they used urine, in this case in the film, their own, but I'm sure they used cattle urine as well, to soften the fabric of the cloth. And obviously it would need to be well washed after that before it could be sold. So there's the process going on. So the women did the starting and the men did the weaving and then the finishing. And this went on. Tillicoultry serge, which was something called shalloon, seems to have started to be made in the 16th century. Certainly by Mary Queen of Scots' time, it's mentioned then, and it was quite famous. And it's a worsted warp and I think a linen weft, and that was regarded as very good quality cloth. They made it in Alva and various other places as well, but Tillicoultry serge was supposed to be the best. And it was taken to sale in Perth, the markets in Perth and Edinburgh, and later on in Glasgow as well, and various other towns too. As the 18th century wore on, as time wore on, obviously there were inventions which enabled the Industrial Revolution to start. And I'm going to come to those in a second, but this is again a little painting to show an idea of the first modest-sized mill which was built in the Hillfoots. And here you have the water being brought to the mill wheel through via a timber aqueduct. And this is called an overshot wheel simply because the water goes over the top of it and turns the wheel. And once those mills were built, then you could accommodate a lot of wooden looms, such as you've seen before, in them. You see that's a whole run of looms all the way down. I don't know exactly where this which mill this photograph was taken in. It's not identified, but it gives you an idea of the scale. And initially there was a huge, a great deal of reservation among the men. They felt that their domestic industry, their trade was going to be threatened, and they refused to work in the mill owners and in the larger buildings. Generally, I think the women were more pragmatic and said that they would work in them. Eventually, the men did work in the mills, and the labour was shared. But you know, if you see a lot of the photographs from the 19th century, you'll see, generally speaking, it's the women who are operating the looms. The men did up to a point, but also kept everything, all the machinery, in good working order as well. The inventions in the middle to later 18th century of James Hargreaves, who, I know this is too small for you to see properly, who invented the spinning jenny, which enabled a worker to use 8 spools, later on about 120 at a time. And then the more famous Richard Arkwright's water-powered water frame, which is this, enabled, just change the character of the industry completely, really. And then when the spinning wheel was invented in the 1770s, and then this self-acting one came in, meaning it can run itself, really, came in and was patented in 1825. Again, revolutionized the industry. There are a couple of photographs, I think, again, in the county where the spinning mules are here, and they're running quite a lot of other machinery as well. So it really just, as I say, revolutionized the operating in mills. The power loom, the invention of the power loom as well, also speeded up the process dramatically. And this loom was made for the Harris Tweed industry in Keighley in West Yorkshire, and also used to be in the Mill Trail Visitor Centre. Some of you will have seen it before. And made specifically for the Harris Tweed industry, in fact. Manual at first, but later electrified. This, I think, is one of the mills in Sochi. And again, you can see that it's mainly the women who are operating the looms, with a man having his photo taken, but I'm sure he could also have been operating the looms and keeping them in good order, because once these are all made of cast iron, they all need to be kept well oiled. Actually, you can see that there's a very similar wheel on the end, 2 similar wheels on the end of this loom here. There's a lot of moving parts there which could get clogged up by wool fibres and so on, as you'll realise. So everything needed to be kept well oiled, well cleaned and so on, so that it operated efficiently. Okay, that's a sort of brief background to how the industrial, very brief background to the Industrial Revolution. I'm now going to work my way along from the west, along the Hillfoots, just to tell you about the mills that were here. So this is Menstrie, the first edition Ordnance Survey map of Menstrie, around about 1860, these were all done, surveyed. And the carding and spinning mill, which you see marked there, was established around about 1800 or so, and it was the three Archibald brothers from Tullibody, in fact, went there and established this quite modest-sized mill. 2 of them left and went off to set up other mills along the Hillfoots, first in Alva and then in Tillicoultry. So you hear the Archibald name cropping up over and over again. And one of them, John Archibald, stayed here and ran this with his sons. And it went on and into the early 20th century, and before dwindling away. And it's the only one that's there at this time in the mid-19th century, as you can see. For those of you who know, I'm not sure if you all live in the area or know it well, but Menstrie Place is now known as Menstrie Castle, just to give you your bearings. And you can see that the original village had grown up along the back of road, the Hillfoots road along there. By the time this map was done, the toll road, which was established in 1807, had been built lower to the south of the back road and on the flatter ground, and it made possible to have a much more streamlined, easier route east-west, and obviously that's the A91 now. The second edition Ordnance Survey map of showing Menstrie shows that the carding and spinning mill is still there. We have no photographs of it whatsoever. I think it had probably gone really in the early 20th century. It declined and disappeared, and there are no, as I say, as far as I'm aware, no photographs. If anybody's ever seen any, I'd be very interested. And there was also by then Forth Vale Mills, about which we know practically nothing, and again no photographs, and then Elmbank Mills, which were established in I think about 1864. There were several buildings, as you can see. The only one that survived is this one, and I'm trying not to look at my notes because it just delays things, but it had a brief boom time, but by 1905 it had dwindled down into making furniture. It was operated by gas, in fact, unlike this carding in the first mill in Menstrie, and there's not very much more information about it, unfortunately, but if you keep that building in mind, there it is. It's the only one that survived, and this was actually not one of the original buildings, but it's the one that's still there, and as far as I'm aware, it's still used, divided up into offices today. And this is a typical mill building. It's a bit short, sometimes they're much bigger, as you'll see, but you know what you need is a lot of light for obvious reasons, so that's why you get a lot of windows in these buildings. These I took, it's a long time since we've had a winter as cold as the one I took these photographs in, but it was such a lovely day. I've never really gone round and taken them all over again because the buildings look pretty good in them, but you've got all this sheet ice. And as I say, it's a long time since we had a winter like that. Moving further east to Alva, this is the about 1756 plan and of the barony of Alva, as it says. The barony was first owned by the Bruce family and then acquired by the Erskine family in the 17th century, about 1630s or so. And this was drawn up when it was still owned by the Erskine family. I've mentioned Sir John Erskine already, who found the silver on his estate in 1714 or thereabouts, and made a fortune from it, and then sank it all looking for other minerals like cobalt and so on, and trying to do mining and so forth, not very successfully. But it's not a very good map, but I thought it was worth showing. There is Alva House up here, and the avenue there, and all the planting. He did a huge amount of planting, and if you look at this, has got nothing really to do with the Industrial Revolution, but if you look at the hills today, it always strikes me how much more heavily wooded the hill above Alva is, Wood Hill in fact, than anywhere else along the Hillfoots, and it's largely down to the Erskine family and the Johnstons for planting a lot of trees on the hill, which have the planting scheme survived and stopped erosion of the hillside very effectively. Now Alva itself was actually over there and is still very small, and there is a detail of it. You can see it's still quite tiny in 1756. So John Erskine let quite a lot of feuds around this area, and clearly he seems to wanted to establish a more substantial village. And there were two sides of a square were built called Green Square. There's a bit of it left today on the west side of the burn. There is the burn coming down, and Green Square was established there. And excuse me, and the towns remained fairly small until the 19th century, and there we have the first edition Ordnance Survey map for Alva. I'm not going to talk about all of these, I'll just point a few of them out though. So there is the toll road running through. There is the, there's Green Square there. The Baptist Church is, to help you get your bearings, the Baptist Church is, I think, in what's left of Green Square now. And not surprisingly, almost all of the mills were established along the burn. So you have the Upper Strood Mill up here. The earliest version of that and the Ball Mill was around about the 1790s, 1800. And again, I'm not going to talk about all the owners. I'll mention a few of the names, like William Drysdale, who was very busy with mills, mill owner and developer during right through the 19th century, and wrote an account actually in the 1880s, I think, of the development of mills in Alva. So that's William Drysdale there. But the earliest mill, which probably isn't shown there because it hadn't survived, I think it burned down, was established in the late 18th, early 19th century. But these are, just to point some of them out, the Ball Mill, and the building that we now know as the Strood Mill is that one there. The upper Strood Mill here and the lower Strood Mill, that was quite a complex of buildings here. Island Mill, that is Island Mill there, which is now the Masonic Hall. And I think it was called Island Mill because it was on the east side of the burn, but it had this lade, this water lade running through along the side of it, and probably was used to power the mill. We know very little about it. So it was kind of in between, on a sort of, almost on a sort of island between the burn and the mill lade, which came through here. These cottages, which are still there today, if you know Alva, they, I think, were all weavers' cottages. And there was, of course, Braehead Mill, which was tucked in behind them. And then further down the burn, you've got Bridge Mill, and they all say woolen. Well, Island Mill doesn't, but that Bridge, the rest of them do. And that was on the east side of the burn. And quite often a lade would be taking water. In fact, you can see the lade coming along here, water going through the mill, and then it would go back, feed back into the burn, which would sometimes pollute it somewhat. It was a difficult area to deal with. And then to the south of the toll road is Greenfield Mill here, and then the Meadow Mill, and I'll come back to those in a minute. And Cobalcrook Mill was the only one that was away, quite some distance away from the burn, and was established by the local miller, John Scotland, if I remember correctly. And he established that in the, I think I can't quite remember, 1838, the Cobalcrook Mill was established, and carried on into the 1970s, in fact, with various different owners. So these buildings here, a lot of these people would be working in the woolen mills. And you can see, this is now, of course, but back row, now Clark Street. So you see the weavers' cottages, the people not working in their own houses. Some of them would have done originally, but a lot of them would be working in the mills by this time. So they're all clustered here. And of course, up here, Strood Cottage, Oakle Bank, Burn, all those houses are still there, and they are the mill managers and mill owners' houses, as indeed are the larger houses running off to the west along the Clark Street and heading towards Menstrie. This photograph, I think, was probably taken in the late 1950s, early 60s. And there is the Island Mill again, and the burn coming down. There are those cottages I mentioned before. The Braehead Mill has gone now. It was there, and all these houses have been built. They were built, I think, in the late 1940s, very early 50s, all of these. You can just see what was by then called the Strood Mill up there. And again, more cottages along here from mainly probably weavers' cottages. And another view, I'm sorry these photographs aren't very good, but they show things that others don't. So these streets would be, again, for mill workers as well. And this is the lower Strood Mill, and they're the houses, the managers and mill owners' houses I mentioned, and various other buildings to the left of the surviving building as well. And this brilliant advert, I think, was done in the 90s, I think it's pre-war, by the looks of it. Just the fact that it says photographed from an aeroplane with sort of a certain amount of excitement. That's the lower Strood part of well, it's the lower Strood Mill complex as well. And it was the Archibald family again who established the Strood Mills. And it gives you an examples of the different types, the many different types of yarns which they made. And it's just a very nice advert. It's a bit battered. I think it was used in a wool shop before it ended up in the Heritage Collection. And these are patterns from the 1950s, I think, for William Archibald and Son, and that was Strood Mills, Alva, and very much of their time and the style that they're done in. Examples of the patterns for children's garments. Harem, scarem, double knitting, great. And that is the building, the only surviving building of all of that big complex. Looking very sad, I think, in the 1970s when it had closed. Huge building. It was said to have, and obviously it's 6 floors high, probably with the attic as well. It was said to have 365 windows in it. I know this is very sad, but I counted them once, and there are 344 windows in it, so not that far off. And obviously light being very essential for all of the work that was going on. This is one of these other paintings. You might have noticed on the previous photograph the fire escape. This fire never happened, but in Paton's in Alva in the 1820s and 1850s, there were some very bad fires which destroyed one or more of the mill buildings. So, you know, oil on the machinery, wool, deadly for fires. And there was no, I don't think there was a fire service in Alva, so it would have to come initially from Alva. But I don't think this ever actually happened, but obviously it was a potential danger. There it is today, the surviving building converted into flats. It used to have a clock up there, I think, and also a bell. And this big entranceway here was because the wagons used to go through, right through to the back, right through there. You can see much more clearly how it's been an archway. And so it would be the yard where the wagons were filled up before they were sent on their way. Splendid building, and very, very well built, as so many of them were. They often had maple floors because they had to carry such heavy machinery, and maple, Canadian maple, is a very strong wood. So that is Alva in the 1890s, in 1899 in fact, and you see it has grown substantially. I didn't bother to show the Strood, well, you can still see the ball mill and Strood Mill complex up there. You'll see Island Works, probably no longer a mill by this time, and the Braehead Mill is now a laundry. So that's there was boom and bust, tremendous fluctuations in the industry over the time during the 19th century and into the 20th century. And the Bridge Mill, it's not clear what that was being used for, but south of the road, south of Stirling Street as it's called there, Cobalcrook was still a woolen mill, as I've said. The Burnbrae Works had been established by then. There was also, which you'll see in a minute, this very small hand loom shed, which I'll come back to in a second. And you have Springburn Mills, which was here as well in this area, and also the Meadow Mill complex. Now, if you keep that house and that house in mind, and you'll see those again in a minute. That's the little hand loom shed, industrial, you know, post-domestic, but not very big, and that's in Brook Street, still there today, obviously. Probably that was the manager's house tacked onto the end of the mill, but again, just 2 stories really, and 2 flats. It's said to have had oak columns instead of cast iron columns, so it's probably quite early. I'd say, you know, probably early 19th century in date, and again converted into flats. And then the Burnbrae Works down Henry Street, just along from there, was established in the middle of the 19th century. And I love this, telegram shawls, Alva, telephone number 4, and that's an engraving of the works. They, as you can see, they made shawls and, a range of shawls mainly. We have in the Heritage Collection a lovely cashmere shawl. I don't know which mill it was made in, but it was made in Alva and was carried when the Wallace Monument was opened in 1869. It was carried in the procession by the weavers in Alva, and then it was raffled afterwards and someone won it. And it's still in extremely good condition. It was used as a christening shawl, handed down through the family of the man who won it for a long time. So a range of fine fine shawls, fine woolens, and so on were being made in Alva, and indeed all of these towns, as well as bolts of cloth. And that was the Burnbrae works in probably the 1950s, 60s, and that's a similar view today. And so all of these buildings have gone. The only one that survived is that one, I think, further down, with some alterations. And again, it's housing flats, and all of this has been rebuilt, and all the buildings have been demolished and housing built. One of the most important, and probably the one that most people will have heard of in Alva, was the Meadow Mill. And this is a wonderful copper engraving. It's for their stationery, so it would be for putting for letterheads, just similar to the one you saw for the Burnbrae work a little while ago. This is the right way round. It's obviously it's reversed to what it would be looking at, but I've reversed it, so you're seeing the mill as it was. And this is Brook Street here, running along here. And it was very substantial. It was established, it's a bit vague, either somewhere between 1822 and 1839 by the Portius family. It was referred to as the Leviathan. It was the largest mill in Alva, as I've said. And 6 generations of the Portius family ran it until its closure in about 1965. It consisted of a 4-story spinning mill, which is this part here, and 2-story weaving shop with power looms and a dye house, a single-story dye house. And the driving force behind its development was James Portius, later Colonel James Portius, who took over running it in 1854 at the age of 15, and was still a director when he died in 1932 in his 90s. So he was a force to be reckoned with. He expanded it dramatically from its early origins, and it dealt in the 20th century. It dealt mainly with Angora, but we're going to come to that in a second. So this is Colonel James Portius, and that's him again. That's his son, Major Archibald, Colonel Archibald Portius, and then I think that's his son, Major James Portius. And he was married to Emmeline Bailey of the Alva pottery family in Alva, and they had 4 children. These adverts were, this is a very good advert. He looks very young, this young man, and he's operating a loom in Portius's mill, and you can see it says at work on a pattern making hand loom. Over 2,000 patterns, over 2,000 patterns are prepared each year, and no 2 are alike. This is patterns for the weaving, obviously. And here they kept Angora rabbits in the mill. This is the lady who looked after them, a splendid rabbit. And you can see meadow rabbitry, no admittance without permission. And I can't remember how many they kept, but a substantial number. And of course, combed them carefully and used the Angora in their products. And also mohairs as well, I think they used. This is Alan Portius, who was the last of the family to run the mill. This is Emmeline Portius, née Bailey, with 3 of her children, James Portius, Ranald Portius, and this is Alan Portius, and there was a daughter, Mary, as well. And Alan Portius was very much involved in the Scout movement in Scotland. And here he is, Thursday, January the 19th, 1961, with a range of their wares. And as you can see, holds up one of the fine woven cloths produced at his mill. It is a beautifully coloured rug in Shetland and Cheviot wool. And a similar picture, probably taken at the same time, shows the other range that they did. They developed Dream Touch, which was a type of yarn, very, very soft. I don't know whether it had Angora in it, but it was very soft yarn to make very nice shawls and rugs, and that was one of their main products. Sadly, I've talked to Fiona Portius, who was who was Alan Portius's daughter, who said that it was as the time wore on, it became very hard work by the 1960s to make sure the mill ran at a profit, and eventually it did close in 1964, as I said. But that aerial view of it there shows the extent of it, very substantial. As you can see, there is the burn running down through the town, and that house there with the garden, that was where they lived, the Portius family lived. Later on, Colonel Portius had a house at Turf Hills in Fife, but they started off there. If you keep that house there and that house in mind, when I go on to the next one, there it is, gone, as it were. There's that house, there's the family home, which had originally a garden about that size. The mill has gone, and Alva Primary School is there on the site, and various other buildings as well. And obviously parts of the garden have gone and had other houses built in it. But this complex of houses is still there today. And the surviving part of the Burnbrae works, which I mentioned earlier, is that one. And the little hand loom shed, which I also mentioned earlier, is that there. So also off to the west on the western edge of Alva, was the Dalmore Works, later Glentanna Mill, and this is a surviving part of it. It was established later on. It was the 1870s when this was built, with a later addition at the end in the 1880s, I think, or later. That's very 1960s, late 50s advert for Glentanna's Scottish mohairs, and a photograph taken in the 1970s when it was still being used as a mill. And this is the more modern end at this end as well. Latterly, of course, the Mill Trail Visitor Centre was in there, and then a company making embroidering sweatshirts, but I think the whole building is empty now. That's a view from Brook Street, from south of Alva. Just thought I'd show, not a great photograph, all the chimneys that there were, and you can see the Strood Mill and the Meadow Mill and so on there. And oh yes, sorry, I nearly forgot about these. The local artist Morag Knight was commissioned by Fenton's when they were doing the Meadow Hill open cast site to record their progress, and she was also allowed to record industries that were perhaps under threat of closure and so on in the county, and she included in that Ochil Vale works, which obviously was at that time still there in 2003 to 4, and she recorded these women working in various ways, making up garments, I think, in both these cases. They're very nice oil pastels, and that's the warehousing that was at Ochil Vale, which, as I say, was still open at that time, but closed in 2004 and has now gone and has housing built on it, as I'm sure you know. And a very different view, which I took years later, which shows the only surviving building of all of these mill buildings, of all the bigger mill buildings, apart from the odd ones like the Masonic Hall and the handloom shed and so on. The very dominant Strood Mill building at the top of the town. Moving on to Tillicoultry, I'm conscious the time is running along. Again, similar story actually. The village grew up, Westerton of Tillicoultry, grew up along the burn. First edition Ordnance Survey map shows you how it was a lot bigger, actually. Well, yes, it was developing quite well. Very small in around about 1800. I think around then there were only about 21 weavers in the whole parish. But by the time this map was done, it was much more substantial, and quite a number of mills had been built by then. And interestingly, you can see that the streets, which are obviously all still there today, all built at an angle to the hillside, and I think that's to make them less steep and also probably to deal with water runoff as well. Tillicoultry, I'll talk about the mills in a minute, but Tillicoultry, because of the way that the mills operated and where they were built, they created this great big dam in 1824 in Tillicoultry Glen. This is a reconstruction of it, as you can see, a timber dam, and that's a photograph of it taken in the 1920s, 30s, where it was still pretty much intact, although it had been rebuilt, in fact. That was taken in the 1980s, and I have to confess I have never ventured up Tillicoultry Glen, so I have no idea how much, if anything, of it is left now. Somebody might be able to tell me later on. It was pretty dilapidated, as you can see. But the reason they did it was so that they could control the flow of water through the glen and supply water to the various mills in various different ways. So that is why it was done. And here you have, just quickly running through, there were a lot of mills in Tillicoultry. I think there are probably about 20 in total. Oh, not all at the same time, but over time. 16 in Alva. Hillfoot Mill was the only one that was built quite some distance away from the burn. And it had to have its water brought through a timber lade, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. Dawson's Mill, company mill set up by a consortium, as the name suggests. The Oldcastle Mill, which was the earliest one, around about 1800 or so, and then the Newcastle Mill, followed by the Newcastle Mill, the Clock Mill, which you'll be familiar with, I think, middle of the town mill there, just because it was in the middle of the town, and then not to be confused with Middleton Mill, which was at the bottom near the toll road. And these were all established in the first half of the 19th century. And working from the top, that's the Newcastle Mill, which I think was established by the Walker family, if I remember correctly. And that house, the manager's house shown in this engraving, is still there today. And you can see Tillicoultry Quarry behind it. And the burn ran through the site, in fact. And that's the site of it today. It went over the top of the burn, so the burn's running down through there. The Walker family became very wealthy. In fact, you know, all of these people, these mill owners, pretty well, most of them became fairly well-to-do as the 19th century progressed. And this is an example of that, very splendid monument erected by Robert Walker in memory of his father, George Walker, who was the one, I think, who established the Oldcastle Mill and then modified the Newcastle Mill. And this is a pretty splendid monument in Tillicoultry churchyard from 1859. This is also worth noting that there was the Board of Trustees, Fisheries, Manufacturers Improvement Scotland. The grants were available to these manufacturers, and here you have George and Andrew Walker in Tillicoultry. So it's this George Walker who's been mentioned here, and his brother, Clackmannanshire, towards the machinery which they have there erected at an expense of £682, which was quite a lot of money. They got a grant of £70, and James and David Paton, also in Tillicoultry, got a grant towards machinery which they were about to set up, estimated to cost £763, and they also got a £70 grant towards doing this, and that's in 1825. So they were able to, and obviously industry was encouraged. Hillfoot Mill was the big mill which I mentioned to the west of the burn, and it had an aqueduct bringing water, a lade, a sort of overground lade, bringing water from the reservoir to the mill, and it had this extra structure added on in the 1830s with this huge wheel, which you can see. Obviously it was hidden in the wheelhouse, but this drawing shows you where it was. So a very big wheel which the water from the aqueduct powered to power the machinery in the loom, in the mill. Eventually, many of them were gas powered later on. An artist's impression which shows looking southwards, where it shows you Hillfoot Mill, which I've just mentioned, the company or horse mill, Dawson's Mill, which was quite small, the Newcastle Mill, the Oldcastle Mill. There's the Clock Mill as well. Middle of the town mill. Various members of the Archibald family developed that, and there were also the Christie family as well, who I think set up the Oldcastle Mill originally, and then the Walkers took it over. And then the Middleton Mill, the big mill at the bottom. J&D Paton's mill was down there. Come to that in a minute. In fact, I'm coming to that now. James and David Paton were the two eldest sons of John Paton, who set up John Paton's Son Company, the wool spinning mill, which became this huge empire in Alva in 1814. For some reason, they didn't join the family business. They went off and did their own thing in Tillicoultry. And this is one of the buildings, their main spinning and weaving mill here. This is it when it was empty. I think it stopped in the 1970s. Also an example of how it was a dangerous place. This is an example of an accident which happened to probably a young girl working in this mill in 1870, broke her arm at the elbow joint, and that was reported in the Alva Advertiser. And I'm sure that is one of many examples that there were. Some of the workers at J&D Paton's, probably taken in the 1890s. I'm not sure whether they were working in the looms or whether they were working in the offices, and what the young man, I shouldn't say boy, was doing, but quite a formal photograph, and it was handed down through a family because one of their relatives was in the photograph. Oh, sorry, I've inadvertently hit the wrong button. J&D Paton's did very well in the at the Great Exhibition in 1851, surviving letter, which shows you how popular tartan, having been prescribed by the after Culloden in the 18th century, became very popular after George IV visited Edinburgh in the 19th century, and also popularised by Queen Victoria. And there's quite a substantial order for shawls in various different tartans that they had been placed to be supplied to the Great Exhibition in 1851. There's the main surviving building, also converted into flats, and the other building, the other main office block, is also still there and also converted into flats. Looking at the clock mill, back up the burn, we have, it's just called the clock mill because there's a clock on it, which still, I hope, works to this day. It was quite a small mill, in fact. It was established, yeah, can't remember, sorry, and I'm not going to waste time looking to see who built it, but it's 1820s, if I remember correctly, as well, as so many of them were. And it's just on the side of the burn. This is the clock mill here. This is what happened on the 28th of August, 1877. A very, very wet August, lots of rain, a bit like we had actually. Lots of rain for several days. The hills were saturated, and on the 20th of August, very early in the morning, the dam, the water just broke through the dam that I showed you before, and came crashing down the burn, bringing lots of boulders, rocks with it, and did a huge amount of damage through the town. That is the Newcastle Mill, I think, up here. The clock mill escaped unscathed. That was what was left of the bridge, which a later version of is still there to this day. And you can see the devastation that's been caused, both mainly to the old castle mill, which was there. 3 people were swept away. One of the men, he was rescued, but there were 2, the owner of the old castle mill, Mr. Hutchison, and one of his workers was standing on the bridge when it happened, and they were swept away, and they both drowned. So there were 2 fatalities as a result of this. This is a view from further down the burn side. You can see that's the clock mill again. That's the middle of the town mill, and you can see how the street was very badly disturbed, and that's a house on this side further down, side of the house taken off as well. So that's looking that's the west side of the burn, as I said. And that's what happened to the old castle mill. It was really virtually destroyed. You can see all the equipment, and the whole of this side of the building has gone. We have, because of the photographer John Cummings, a very good photographic record of the damage that was done. But by then, the town council had come into existence. What was going on with all of these towns, the development was so rapid from the late 18th century to by the middle of the 19th century, the industrialisation happened so quickly that the infrastructure really wasn't there to cope with the incoming increase in the population and so on, which was quite dramatic, as you'll see. If I can just quote, in 1821, there were about 1,160 people living in Tillicoultry, and that was a mistake, sorry. And by 1881, there were 5,544 people living. So that's a big increase in population in Tillicoultry, as an example. And Alva increased quite dramatically too. People wanted, the conditions, the housing conditions weren't great. People wanted to manage their own affairs. And when the Police Burgh Act came in 1852, the towns across Scotland were very quick to want to run themselves. Alva was the first one in the county, 1854, to become a police borough. Alva was the next, 1856, and Tillicoultry in 1871. And so by the time of that terrible flood, the town, there was a town council running the affairs of the town, looking after the cleansing and the gas supply and so on. And they were very quick to repair. They also had to look after that dam up the glen, and they were very quick to repair it and get the town functioning again. In really only within a few months, everything was tidied up and put right. This is the northwest side of the Clackmannanshire. It had, because it was on the west side of the burn, the lade came round and was fed through an aqueduct here, there, and there you can see the scar of the overshot wheel there, and that's where the water came through and ran over the wheel to power the wheel that was on the west side of the building. That is it when it was being converted into the first version of the Mill Trail Visitor Centre in the 1980s, and a view of the east side of it, showing the burn running down. I think once that terrible flood had happened, all of this, a very substantial wall was built on either side of the burn, and I think all this terracing was done then as well, probably with some later modifications to make sure that the water would be contained, and that flood, it could never spread out over the town again. The water, after it had gone over the wheel on the side of the Clackmannanshire, came out back into the burn through this channel here. Moving down, this is the burn side further down, and the middle of the town mill was there. Weavers' cottages, long gone, sadly, and that's the corner of the office block of the Middleton Mill. And that's still there to this day, what's left of the huge Middleton Mill with the blocked up windows there. And that building you saw on that old postcard is that. There's still now the Middleton Mill sign above the doorway, the original entrance into it as well. But many of those went during the first half of the 20th century. They declined and disappeared. And I'll just mention now, if for those of you who want, in fact, no, I'll do that at the end. That's the 1899 map of Tillicoultry. It hadn't grown a huge amount, but was developing a bit, as you can see. And also Devon's side, there were 3 or 4 mills in Devon's side which had been set up in the 1830s onwards as well. That's a view looking at Devon's side there. And of course, J&R Archibald, having established various mills here, also moved on to create Devonvale Mill here to the south. And of course, also the railway had come to Tillicoultry as well. And they built their mill quite close to the railway. Eventually, I mean, it's now Sterling Furniture Warehouse, as you'll know, but eventually, later on, it stopped being a woolen mill and became part of Samuel Jones' paper milling empire. A few views of Tillicoultry taken from the southeast, looking over. That was Devonvale House, now gone. It was still here when I first came up to the county in 1999, but was then later demolished for new development of the Sterling Furniture Warehouse. You can just see there's Craigfoot Mill at the top, probably taken in the very early 20th century. You can see all the chimneys. There was also the Oak Mill further over, which I think possibly is that, or maybe a bit off the picture. And you can just see all the chimneys and the mills, which were all still functioning there. Just to give you a bearings also, there's the old institute, the tower of which has still survived. And Similar view, the viaduct bringing the railway over, Devonvale Mills, and again, the rest of the mills still surviving there. The people, the workers were politically very active. In Tillicoultry, they had a weavers' strike in 1837 for better pay and conditions. And also in 1884, they all took part in the reform demonstration, which happened in the West End Park in Alva. And this is a banner which we have in the Heritage Collection, which was made for that demonstration. They processed from Tillicoultry, from the Devonvale Works in Tillicoultry, all the way to Alva, carrying this banner aloft, like a miner's banner. There's another one which has survived from Tillicoultry from the general population, not specifically related to a mill. And this is a very good example. It shows you exactly what the mill looked like in 1884 as well. And they took part in the demonstration. Obviously, that was for franchise and franchise reform rather than specific working conditions reform. And there is what's left. Quite a lot of the buildings of Devonvale Mill have survived today. And so moving on, do you want me to finish? This won't take long. There are only about 3 more pictures and then I'll be done. Is everybody happy? Yes? Okay, Dollar had a burn, had a glen, has a glen as well, could have developed in a similar way, but it didn't. And why was that? This is, again, the first edition Ordnance Survey map. You saw it on all of those early maps as well. Very, very tiny place. Castle Campbell off the picture up here, higher up Dollar Glen. But you can see, if you look closely, Woolen Mill here. And it's this building here, just on the side of the burn, on the east of the burn side. And there is the old back road there. So it was very close to the back road and the old high street. Dollar started off here. Interestingly, Cashmere Cottage. I'm not sure if that was relevant, but anyway, don't know whether that's still there today. It might be. And then the rest of Dollar started to develop further down once the toll road was built. Anyway, Dollar, this little woolen mill seems to have developed in the very, very early, late 18th, very turn of the century, 1800. And the town could have developed in the same way, except for McNabb's School, or Dollar Institution as it's called on this map. And some of you will know this, but a local lad, John McNabb, went off from Dollar to make his fortune, did make his fortune, left a bequest after his death in 1802 to found a school for the poor of the parish, as he said, or an institution. And after a long time, and a lot of he left it to the church heritors, who didn't quite know what to do with this sum of money. They were allowed to use the interest on the bequest, if I remember correctly, which was the equivalent of about £2 million today. And they sat on it for a while until a new minister, Andrew Milne, arrived at Dollar, and he was very driven, very ambitious, thought that it was time to create something big and better, something really special. And he was the driving force behind the creation of what is now Dollar Academy. And he brought William Playfair, the most fashionable and dynamic architect, Edinburgh architect of the day, designed the original Dollar Academy building. And because of that, it is said that the heritors, once the school was built and people wanted to send their children here, that is why, by the time this map was done, Dollar has grown to the size it has. It's all to do with people moving into the parish so they could send their children to a school which very quickly adapted established a reputation for itself as a very good school. And it's said that the heritors of the church and the school, the people running the school, quite emphatically prevented the development of very much industry in Dollar, so that that's why it's developed in a different way. I mean, you can see it had gasworks and so on, and there were the bleach fields further down by the River Devon off the picture here, but it developed in quite a different way. So you see it in the 1860s, and then you see it in 1899 with the railway also coming to Dollar by then, how much bigger it has grown. And it's really all to do with what is now Dollar Academy. And if you look up here, you'll see that the woolen mill has gone and has become Castle Campbell Hall. And of course, it's now Dollar Museum. So the building is still there, but nothing much else developed in Dollar as a result of Dollar Academy. So as I say, it's interesting how it grew in a completely different way from all of the other Hillfoots villages. And finally, just to show you the population in the development of the population, there you are, how different it was. And this rise in population in Alva, and particularly in Tillicoultry, from 1800 through to the 1890s, that's quite a dramatic increase in population there that you see, whereas Dollar had its peak, but was a much more incremental rise because it didn't develop as an industrial town. And just to finish off, just so you know, if I can find the numbers, just for comparison, some of you will know this, but today Alva has a population of, you can see where it ended up by 1960 or so. Alva today has a population of 4,460 or so. So somewhat less than it had at its peak. Tillicoultry has 5,900, which is a bit higher than its peak, than at its peak in 1890. And Dollar has 2,800, which it's remained relatively steady, really. So there you are. I'm sure there are lots of things I haven't said, but that's where I'm going to stop because I've talked for too long, and I'm happy to try and answer more detailed questions or anything else that anyone would like to ask. And there's a pretty picture, a bit more detailed to show to finish off. I'm sure that the story of the Industrial Revolution in the Hillfoots is mirrored by many other, lots of other places across Scotland, but this is just an example to get you thinking about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. That was amazing. Really, really interesting.
Thank you.
Really interesting.
Excuse me. Thank you.
We've had a few questions in.
Okay.
So Anthea had asked where all the old machines, do you know where they went?
The ones I mentioned.
The one in Alva, I think it was,
yeah.
The spinning ones, yeah.
Yes. Well, the loom. When the Mill Trail Visitor Centre closed, I rescued the looms, the three looms. There were three. There was one, the wooden one from Gala Shields that I mentioned. There was the Kennedy loom, the Harris Tweed loom. And there was a third loom which was made in Dunfermline for the linen industry. None of them, to the best of my knowledge, had been used in the county. They had just been acquired. I don't know where, I've never yet found out where the two metal looms had come from. And I moved them out of the Mill Trail Visitor Centre and moved them into the garage of the Spears Centre to protect them. And I kept on looking after them. And then when I had to move out of the Spears Centre, I can't remember what I do. No, I had to find a home for them. No, I moved them into Mars Street when I moved the entire collection in 2011. And the wooden loom, of course, was dismantleable. The others were more difficult. And then it came, I had to move the collection yet again in 2017. And at that point, I thought it's time, well, 2015, 16, actually, I thought the chances of actually being able, having anywhere to display them in the county were so low that it was time to start finding new homes for them, to protect them. So the wooden loom, strangely enough, the person who had sold it to the project, the Mill Trail Visitor Project, way back in the mid-80s, contacted me. I had met him before, in fact. In fact, I got him to dismantle it because he's a weaver. Got him to dismantle it when he, when we were taking it out of the Mill Trail Visitor Centre, and he got in touch and said, "Have you still got that loom?" So, to cut a long story short, he bought it back for the £100 he'd been paid for it, and he set it up in his shed next to his house in Newborough, and he is weaving tweed on it again. And
wow,
he has
that's great.
Excuse me, he has a helper who helps me, sent me a message during the lockdown, and I haven't managed to get back to him yet about it. And he's weaving lovely tweed. I did see him. I've seen him since, about a couple of years ago. And he showed me an example of this lovely tweed that he was weaving. And it's so nice to think that it's actually being used.
Yeah,
As for the other two, they were more problematic. But to cut a long story short, one of them went to the Harris Tweed Educational Trust and was actually almost immediately shown in an exhibition at Reged near Penrith in Cumbria, in a Harris Tweed exhibition there. They set it up, and then I assume they took it. It went from here to there, to Reged, and then it went to Harris. And I tried very hard to get Fife Museums to take the Dunfermline loom on the grounds that it had actually been made in Dunfermline for the linen industry, but they were busy developing their museum, the new museum at the time, couldn't take it, said they just couldn't. So in the end, that went to the Harris Tweed Educational Trust as well. And I hope it's either still there or has a new home. So there you are.
That's great. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Susan. That's really interesting.
Susan Young, she had asked, she said there was a lot of mills, and it was especially when we were in Alva, and she was just asking how many people would have worked in each.
Golly, I can't tell you the exact number, because sadly the business records for most of these mills haven't survived. Having said that, the business records for the Meadow Mill are there. I think they're in Glasgow, and I haven't looked at them yet, I'm afraid. So I can't tell you, but hundreds, definitely hundreds. There would be more people working in them than were living in each of the settlements, I would think. Some people would travel in, but a lot of it, of course, on the other hand, was automated as well. So probably not hundreds and hundreds. I know there were thousands working in Paton's Mill in Alva, but that was a huge enterprise. None of the ones in Alva and along the Hillfoots were as big as that. But yeah, hundreds of people, maybe into the couple of thousand in total, probably, in the whole town, not in each individual mill, but in the whole town. Okay.
Yeah. Joy Henry had said she was just asking, did the visitor centre do any better when it moved from the clock mill in Tilly to Alva? I
think it did. I mean, I didn't see it when it was in the clock mill. It had already been moved. I think it did pretty well. And of course, the tourism, the tourist board visitor centre was in there as well. And it seemed to do very well until the tourist board, what's now Visit Scotland, decided to close it. And then, I don't know, clearly maybe the numbers didn't stack up, but it seemed pretty well used. And I think it was a great loss when it closed, and it moved briefly into Stirling Mills, but it was a shame. I mean, it's true all over. They've closed a lot of TICs, tourism information centres now. Just a shame that it's gone, and everything's online now, of course, but the experience of seeing that equipment, and there was a very nice presentation, a slideshow as it was then, or a film, which visitors could see in the Mill Trail Visitor Centre as well. But yeah, I think the numbers just weren't good enough, and they just that's why they closed it.
Joy also said, unfortunately, the clock doesn't work anymore. That was in the Tillicoultry.
Oh, yeah, it's a while since I looked at it. I think I remember being taken to see it when the building was empty by a clock enthusiast, and the mechanism was all still there, but of course it requires, if it's not electrified, it requires someone to wind it. So yeah, a shame.
No problem. A lot of messages just saying that it was an amazing talk, really interesting. A lot of people have had to go, but Anthea's asked another question. Anthea, do you want to come in and ask it, or?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So Susan, did these all remain mainly water driven, or did they transfer? Did any of them transfer to coal driven?
They
steam driven.
Steam, yes, and they used coal. The more coal, once the mining increased. They did use coal as well, and then gas powered as well.
Yeah, you mentioned gas power,
Most
so I
of
was
the
interested, and that's why I
towns-
asked about. So,
Yeah.
did what sort of period? I mean, what percentage of them, or did many of them just not make that transfer and then just stop at that
No,
point?
I think they probably pretty well all made the transfer. Some
Right.
of those earlier ones up the burn in Alva, the smaller ones probably never did. But I think the bigger mills, like I'm sure the Meadow Mill was gas powered, and later on, and also the bigger ones in Tillicoultry, I think also they were all converted. As time went on, I can't give you the exact, well, I mean, I'll try and do this for tomorrow. I'll go through my notes and see if I can get a summary of how many transferred to gas. But just so that you know, I meant to tell everybody, this book here, the woolen mill buildings in the Hillfoots area, that was written by Brian Park, latterly of Page Park Architects, when he got a grant as a student in 1979 to do this. It's still, at the time when he did it, it's a lot of the buildings which have gone now were still there, and some of the mills were still actually working in the late 70s. And that has a lot of information about the individual mills, as much as he was able to gather, and that gives you a lot of information about how they were powered as well. So it was very variable depending on how big they were and how much the mill owners could afford. You know.
Thanks, Susan. That's great.